If you lived in a place which had access to amazing, complex hilts that protect your hand like this, why on earth would you use a sword like this? Well, there are some reasons. Let's have a look at them. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So first of all, this video is inspired by my recent video which went up on Scalagrim's channel, which I did with him when he was over here filming, where we talked about fantasy weapons, okay, weapons which exist in a world, in a universe, in a time where we might find weapons like this, if you want to call it a rapier, a side sword, whatever you want to call it, a swept hilt, exist in the same place as things like this. I know that people will ask, by the way, this is the LK Chen Munich Town Guard sword. This is a new sword from Windlass, which is the Graham sword. I will be reviewing this in due course. But anyway, Viking era hilt and a late 16th, early 17th century hilt. Right, so these are from different times in history. So comparing these two things seems a little bit unfair, doesn't it? Because this is a 16th, 17th century sword and this is a sort of 10th century inspired sword. However, we have to bear in mind that in the time of these, there were also swords like these with simple hilts. If I just put down the Viking hilt for a second, let's pick up the beloved Langmesser or hanger. Okay, they were still really, really popular at the same time that these were around, and that's just in Europe, that's in the same area. Obviously, if we go to different parts of the world, if we go to Southeast Asia, China, the Far East, if we go to Africa and other parts of Asia, we will find simple hilts. We find even in the 19th century, at the time when you've got saber hilts and basket hilts and things like this, you find the Chinese just using a little disc guard, and obviously the Japanese tsuba. African swords often only have a simple cross guard, and in Europe, it's not just a kind of Europe and non-Europe thing. Even in Europe, we still find very simple knuckle bows or very simple cross guards are still in use. So just because they invented these doesn't mean that they stopped using the simpler hilts. So if we just talk about the fantasy setting for a minute, and I know this won't interest everyone, but I know it does interest quite a few of you. If we talk about the fantasy setting, I was thinking this when I was watching back the video that I did with Scal. In actual fact, it's perfectly acceptable to have swords like this in the same universe as swords like this, because they did exist and they do exist in our world as well. So in this video, we're going to look at 4 reasons why you might choose a simple or minimalist hilt like this or like a Chinese sword, as opposed to this amazingly awesome designed swept hilt. Why would you choose that instead of that? So I know that a lot of my viewers are concerned about their security, and these days that obviously includes your online security. And of course, one of the safest ways to protect yourself from malicious content and hackers and all that sort of nasty stuff is with a VPN. More and more people are using VPNs as standard now, including myself. And that's why today's video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. And we've got a great offer for you, which you're not going to want to miss out on. With ExpressVPN, all of your information goes through a VPN tunnel. It's totally secure. Your IP address is hidden and all of your data is encrypted. And ExpressVPN is available on all platforms, including Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, and lots more. Now, ExpressVPN has a strict no logs policy, which means absolutely nobody can know about your online activity. Did you know that incognito mode isn't actually incognito? Your service provider and lots of other people can actually see what you've been doing. However, when you connect with ExpressVPN, your connection goes through an encrypted server, which is basically military-grade security, so absolutely nobody can see what you're doing. So essentially you can use ExpressVPN to change your IP appearance to that of any other country, which means you can access blocked international libraries of over 50 streaming services such as Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, and many, many more. Just choose a country from out of the 100+ countries on ExpressVPN. This literally opens up the internet to you and can help you get better deals. And you can use your subscription to connect up to 8 devices, so your friends and family can benefit as well. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 support, so there's absolutely nothing to risk. ExpressVPN has millions of users worldwide and a very high rating on Trustpilot. It's also rated as the best VPN by CNET, PC World, The Verge and more, so it's definitely one of the best VPNs on the market. So here's the special deal for my viewers today. ExpressVPN have given me their best deal ever with a 48% discount and an extra 3 months for free. Just check out that link down below. Thanks to ExpressVPN, you can access geographically restricted content, find better deals online, play games blocked in your region, protect your identity by keeping your data encrypted, and access blocked libraries of over 50 streaming services. So check them out right now, they're the best. And if you use that link down below, you'll help support the channel here and you'll get 3 months for free. Right, so thanks for sticking with me. Now let's get back to these 4 points. So why would you choose the simple or minimalist hilt over the amazing swept hilt? Okay, well, the first obvious point, at least obvious to me, it might not be obvious to everyone, is convenience of wear. And it's a little bit of a bigger point than just that. So it should be fairly obvious that if you're wearing a sword like this, and I'll just put it in its scabbard for a second, if you've got a fairly minimal hilt, you don't have a particularly long crossguard and you don't have a particularly long hilt, you don't have knuckle bows or side rings or finger rings. When this thing is against your side and you're wearing it, okay, when it's mounted on here, it's not really going to get in the way of anything. It's really, really convenient to wear. And if we go to a later period, although again, as I point out, you can find some of these things around at the same time in history. If we go to the Langmesser, I've talked about this in previous videos. I have worn this Langmesser in a living history and reenactment context, and it is super, you just forget it's there. Because of the length, because of the lack of long crossguard or side rings, it's really easy and comfortable to wear. But it's not only about everyday life and everyday living, it's also about combat, because bear in mind that this is very often a backup weapon. So if your primary weapon is a musket or an arquebus or a longbow or a crossbow or a spear or a pike or a halberd or any of these big main battlefield weapons, this is a backup. Even in the Viking era, very often the sword is a backup to a spear, usually, sometimes a two-handed Danax, but something bigger. Even in the age of these swords, this is usually a backup, usually at this period, to a firearm or missile weapon, or indeed something like a pike or a halberd or a bill. So this is a backup as well. Now, if you're primarily wearing your sword, something which has a much more minimalistic hilt is a lot easier and convenient and very often lighter to wear. So the next point why you might like a more minimalistic hilt is connected to the previous point. Now, think about a time where this is either, there's two options here, either it's a backup weapon to a primary weapon. So your primary weapon, you might be loading and shooting a musket or using a bow or holding a pike or this type of thing, and this is your backup. Or in civilian life, this is your main weapon because you're traveling around or you're going around a dangerous town or this kind of thing. So you're not carrying a longbow or a pike or a gun, but you are wearing a sword. In both of those situations, think about what's the really important moment that you have to draw this thing, okay? There is an important moment at which you are attacked and you think, holy crap, I need to get my sword out. Now, this topic is actually touched on in George Silver's treatise, the particularly Paradoxes of Defence from 1599. We think it's 1599. And he actually talks about hilt designs, and he talks about basket hilts. Now, what's really, really interesting is to access a sword. Let's just sheathe this swept hilt here. Certain types of hilt are more or less convenient to access, okay? Now, I have to be honest, this isn't actually terribly difficult to access. So to access the swept hilt is pretty damned easy. But a fully enclosed basket hilt, which comes around the side, I'm looking around, I don't actually have one to hand, where it comes to the side of the pommel, is actually, can be more of a nuisance to get your hand quickly into, and therefore more difficult to get in, slower to get out, and in that time it might be too late. Now, just generally speaking, swept hilts are a bit more fussy to do that with than something which is completely open, where your hand can easily get down to the hilt with no delays and immediately get the thing out. And obviously, the ultimate evolution of this is something like Iaido in Japanese martial arts, where you have nothing in the way of the grip and you have a long grip. So where you've got a long handle or grip, it's easy to get any part of that sword down there, get your hand quickly onto it. There's nothing in the way. Ironically, there is something in the way with this. Potentially you could get in the way of that knuckle bow, something to bear in mind. But with the Japanese sword, you just have the tsuba. You can easily get it out and get it out as quickly as possible. And you'll also notice, of course, a shorter blade is also quicker to get out than a longer blade. But I guess that's outside of the scope of this topic. But anyway, so easier and more convenient to wear, especially if it's a backup weapon, but also if it's just your civilian sidearm. And easier to get out, potentially, if you have a simpler hilt. And actually that's a really, really important point to remember, because when we're talking about these sorts of weapons and we do, oh, X versus Y, which is better? This one's got more hand protection, so it must be a better sword. The reality is these swords usually weren't deployed in reality from a dueling, you've got the sword out ready to go position, okay? If you are in that position, and if you're in an organised duel and you know that the opponent's going to have a sword rather than a halberd or something else, then indeed more hand protection is usually better. Although it does have some drawbacks, it adds more weight to the weapon and things like that. But generally speaking, more hand protection is better. But the reality, much like pistols or knives or other everyday carries, the reality is that this is a weapon which, when you first need to use it, it's going to be in its scabbard. And that's why the longest rapier or the biggest handguard is not always the best thing to go for. Very often, the thing which is best is the thing which is quickest to deploy. Because if you can deploy it quicker than the opponent, then hand protection really doesn't matter that much if they've already stabbed or chopped your head off at that point. So, hand protection, I think, in a lot of YouTube channels like mine, maybe I'm partly guilty of this, sometimes gets overrated because people don't think about it in a typical everyday scenario where you might actually need to deploy this weapon. Right, now some of you may have thought of this when I started this video. There is another specific environment where I have personally found that developed hilts, swept hilts, basket hilts, things like this, can be a pain in the butt. Now, can you think what it is? As a HEMA person, when I'm fencing, why might a hilt be a pain in the butt? Well, I will tell you. So over the years, I have dabbled in the world of sword and buckler and sword and shield. And what you will find, if you're used to using an arming sword or something with a simple hilt, you will find that complex hilts clash a lot with bucklers. Now you can get used to it, I have to admit, so it's more of a problem for me because I'm used to using arming swords. So when I switch, or simple side swords, when I switch to a more, a wider essentially swept hilt or a basket hilt, I find that they clash and sometimes smash my own hand, incidentally, inside the buckler. They clash with either my hand or the buckler in really annoying ways. And for example, if you want to thrust, you'll often find that the hilt actually mashes your own fingers or smashes into your buckler in an annoying way that a simple hilt, if I just grab the messer here, a simple hilt doesn't, and you can put the hands completely together and get the two weapons close, which you can't do if you've got projecting side bits. Now, that is, I would say, even more of a problem when you're using a big-ass shield. Now, not to say that swept hilts weren't used with shields. Of course they were. The Spanish, the Scots, various people throughout history have used forms of larger shield, boss gripped and strapped, with forms of basket hilt. Absolutely, you can develop styles of fighting for those two things, and it's a very formidable combination. However, in my opinion, if I just go back to the Viking style sword, because it's more appropriate to this shield, having a simple hilt, and when you've got a big shield that can cover your sword arm, means you can get the two things very close together and get angles around the thing, whereby the hilt isn't a problem in conflicting with your hand or the shield, either the edge of the shield or smashing your own hand on the inside of the shield, or just not being able to get the two things very close together. So personally, and does your opinion, does your experience differ from this? My opinion is that actually simple hilts work better with bucklers and shields than complex hilts do. And it's a chicken and egg thing, because you could also say that, well, if you don't have a buckler or a shield, if you've just got a sword, you need a swept hilt or a basket hilt more. So that makes more sense. If this is your only weapon and you don't have something in the other hand, or you just have a dagger, then having a swept hilt or a basket hilt makes more sense. But equally, on the flip side, if you do have a shield or a buckler, you don't really need the big hilt quite so much anyway. So the final reason why you might choose a simple or minimalistic hilt instead of a complex swept hilt or basket hilt is maybe one that you might not be thinking of, because it's outside of the usual scope of this channel. But coming at this with my archaeologist and anthropology and historian hats on, economy. It's as simple as that. A simple hilt, whether it's a Japanese tsuba or the disc guard on a Chinese sword, or a Burmese da which has no guard at all, or whether it's one of these European sort of hangers or kutos, something like this Langmesser here, are a lot cheaper, quicker and easier to make than these complex hilts. And you know, of the complex hilts, I would say the Spanish probably found the way of mass producing relatively complex hilts and protective hilts in the form of the cup hilt used also on the Bilbo broadsword. And that is a relatively easy hilt to make, but it's still more complicated than the simple messer or saber, or indeed, you know, something like a cutlass, or indeed any kind of Asian swords, or most Asian swords. Things like swept hilts like this, or the various forms, complex forms of Italian and Spanish particularly, but also French and other, even English, complex hilts, are a lot more work to make. So yes, you can equip armies with these, and people did. However, when you start to get towards the late 17th century, you see things like the Walloon hilt come along, and Walloon hilts are clearly easier to mass produce than things like this are. This is a lot of work using the technology of the day. This is not so much work. You know, no disrespect to Krieger Historical Weapons who made this. It's very nice. But this is a much simpler hilt to make using period technology than this is. Ironically, LK Chen, I think, basically cast these stainless steel hilts, but in period, they would be forge welded out of bars of mild steel or iron. So much simpler to make, much easier to mass produce. This is much more complex. So there we go. 4 reasons why, either in a fantasy universe, which you might be writing books or role-playing games for, or in our own actual historical world, these two things, simple basic hilts and fairly open and not very protective hilts, always existed alongside these more complex hilts. And actually these more complex hilts, actually in the grand scheme of things, weren't around for anything like as much of history as the simpler hilts were. And even up until the late 19th century, certain types of swords, pioneers' swords, and various Asian and African weapons kept simple hilts, so they didn't disappear. So if you are doing fantasy gaming, it's perfectly fine to have a technology level in a city or town where you do have these sorts of complex hilts, as well as other people that prefer simple hilts for one of the reasons mentioned in this video. Could be because it's simpler to wear, could be because it's cheaper, could be because they're just from a culture that don't have developed hilts, it could be because they use shields or bucklers, or other reasons. Can you think of other reasons why you might like to wear a simpler hilt rather than a complex hilt? Looking forward to seeing your comments down below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you back on the channel soon. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!